Milton's Magical Mystery Tour. As you close your eyes, I'm going to tell you the story of Milton and his Magical Mystery Tour, and with your eyes closed, you can listen to me reading this story. While I read the story, you can begin to feel relaxed, and as I read, you can imagine this story in your mind. Milton loved to sleep. He loved to sleep because he loved to dream. Dreams were his chance to experience strange and interesting worlds. Milton didn't just dream at night, he thought. He often found himself drifting into a dream during the day. He loved to daydream. One day when Milton was in a history class in school, learning about ancient Egypt and how the pyramids were built, he found himself gazing out of the window into the school playground. As he watched the roundabout slowly turning in the wind, dry autumn leaves blowing past the window, his mind began to wander. He started to imagine that the autumn leaves were like the dry sand blowing across a barren desert, and the roundabout was a wheel, with rope being wound and unwound by builders, rotating it to drag huge stones into position to be worked on and shaped. As Milton allowed himself to become absorbed deeper in his daydream, he could hear the sounds of the people speaking, and the clatter of hammers and chisels against the stone blocks. He could see the school playground disappearing as a new reality started to appear outside, one of ancient Egypt. The last thing to disappear was the window he was looking out of, and the school building, then the teacher's voice, which gradually faded away into the background. Milton was now fully absorbed in his daydream. Even though his body was going to stay exactly where it was in reality, in the classroom, in his dream he could get up and move around, and to Milton everything felt totally real. In his daydreams, just like in his nighttime dreams, time was different. Hours of days could pass in his dream world, but he could find that only minutes had passed in the real world. Sometimes it was just seconds. Milton had drifted into a daydream in class many times in the past, and sometimes he found that only a couple of seconds of real-world time had passed, but to him, he had just been off on an adventure for days in a dream world. Within his dream world, Milton stood up and started to walk towards the men who were turning the large, heavy-looking wheel where the roundabout once was. As he walked towards the wheel, he could feel the warmth of the sun on his skin. The sun seemed to be getting warmer with each step he took. Every moment took Milton deeper into his experience. He had often wondered why he seemed to daydream so much in school lessons, and he decided it was because it helped him to learn better. When he lived what he was being taught, he found it easier to remember than just hearing a teacher talking about something. Milton walked along the Egyptians, looking at what they were all doing. There were people dragging a giant stones into an area, ready to be shaped. Others were shaping the stones into different shapes and sizes, depending on where they were going to be used. Others were dragging the stones to where the pyramids were being built. "Young lad," a man called out. "Excuse me, young lad." Milton looked around to see who was calling. There was a friendly-looking man wearing white clothes that looked like they were keeping him very cool. He had a big, kind smile and was looking straight at Milton. Milton guessed he must want to talk to him. "Yes," Milton replied curiously. "I'm the caretaker here. Would you like me to show you around?" Milton thought that would be great. If he got shown around, maybe he could learn what everyone was doing. The caretaker started by describing what Milton already knew. He spoke about the people dragging the stone up to be carved. Then they had skilled people shaping the stones ready to be used to build the pyramid. Then other people would drag the stones to the pyramid, and once there, another team of workers would put that stone into place. Milton thought about what a lot of hard work all this was. He asked, "Why do all this hard work to build a pyramid?" The caretaker explained that the Egyptians believed that the pharaohs, the rulers of the land, were gods walking the earth, and that when they died they needed to return safely to the heavens. So they built pyramids to help them transport back to the afterlife. The pyramids were aligned with the sun, moon and stars so that they could find their way safely into their next life. The caretaker took Milton to a smaller pyramid which was already fully built but not yet used. They walked inside the pyramid to see painters painting on the walls of the pyramid. The caretaker explained that the painters paint the stories of the pharaoh's life on the walls and the stories of the pharaoh's journey into the next life too. He explained that the pharaohs get placed inside the pyramid with their most prized possessions to take with them into the afterlife. Then they get sealed in the pyramid so that no one can disturb them. There are traps and secret passages hidden in the pyramid to try to stop people finding their way to the pharaoh's personal chamber. This gives the pharaoh time to get to the afterlife in peace. Milton watched as a priest appeared at the recently built pyramid and walked just inside the entrance. He wondered why a new pyramid was being built when this one was just being finished. The caretaker explained that the pyramids took many years to make, so he started building the pyramid when the pharaoh came into power. The new pyramids are being built for the new pharaoh. The pyramid just being finished was for the previous pharaoh. The priest raised his staff in the air. The staff had a perfectly smooth, polished crystal at the handle end. He said what sounded like a magical chant. Milton saw blue sparks like lightning erupt from the staff, zigzagging through the air and striking different places on the walls and ceiling inside. There was a loud crack like thunder as the sparks jumped from the staff, and popping, zapping sounds as the sparks jumped from the walls. Milton wondered what was happening. The caretaker explained that the priest was finishing the rituals for preparing the pyramid for the pharaoh. He had to ward off anything bad and leave this as a good place for the pharaoh to make his journey to the afterlife. After a whole day of exploring the pyramids and the different work everyone was doing, and seeing how well everyone seemed to be working as a team to get such a big and difficult structures made, he felt himself drifting away from Egypt. He saw the caretaker walk away and vanish. He walked back to his school desk, which had appeared. Then he noticed Egypt disappearing. As sand turned back to autumn leaves. The wheel turned back into the roundabout, and he could see the window to the classroom peering between him and his view of the autumn scene outside. He could hear the teacher talking in the background about Egypt. He gradually paid the teacher more attention as he drifted back from his daydream, back to the real world in school, just as you can drift slowly deeper into sleep. Patches in the Doghouse. As you close your eyes, I'm going to tell you the story about Patches the puppy, and with your eyes closed, you can listen to me reading this story. While I read this story, you can begin to feel relaxed, and as I read, you can imagine this story in your mind. One day, Patches was playing inside the house. He was trying to see how fast he can jump from each item of furniture. He had a route he was trying to follow to do laps around the living room. Patches jumped from one arm of the sofa to another arm, then over onto the armchair, then from the armchair to the footstool, then over to the beanbag, then up onto the dining room chair, then onto another, and another, then up onto the dining room table. This was as far as Patches could easily get. Up to this point, he could jump very fast from one place to another. But he had to now slow down, as he thought about how he was going to complete his course. He had to jump from the dining room table up onto the bookcase, then carefully make his way along the bookcase without knocking anything off, before jumping over to the fireplace. The fireplace was even more difficult to walk along. There were framed photographs of the family, a clock, some artificial candles, and a bunch of flowers in a vase which he was going to have to navigate. The fireplace shelf was also very narrow. Patches carefully leapt over onto the shelf. There was barely enough room for his tiny paws to fit. He nearly slipped and fell. Patches held his breath for a moment to try to be as still as possible. Once he got his balance, he gently let that breath out and relaxed. "Patches, what are you doing in there?" a voice shouted from the kitchen. Clearly, the mother of the family which owned Patches had heard all of the noise he was making as he jumped around the living room. Patches stayed still and relaxed. He thought to himself that if he stayed still and quiet, the mother would stop paying attention to him and would get on with whatever she was doing in the kitchen. This seemed to work. A minute or two passed, which to Patches felt like an hour, and the mother hadn't come through to the living room or even shouted again. Patches took this as a sign that he could continue to play his game. To jump from the shelf above the fireplace to the top of the television, Patches first had to carefully make his way along the shelf. This wasn't easy. He had to stretch and bend his body around the pictures, the candles, the clock, and the vase of flowers. This was his second lap around the room, so he knew he could do it, but he had to focus and concentrate. He carefully arched his body around the first picture, inadvertently dusting the picture with his fur as he brushed past. He managed to get past the first candle easily, just as he had done before. Passing the clock was fine too, as he was able to step over this. The next candle was trickier, but Patches was proud of himself for managing to pass that, and he passed the second picture fine. The most challenging part of walking along the shelf was passing the flowers in the vase. Patches had passed the flowers before in his first lap, but nearly knocked them down as he passed. The vase was quite wide, and the flowers caught in his fur. He tried to slide past again. As he did, he could feel the flowers tickling his back. They made his tail flick up just as he was jumping off the shelf. Smash! The vase hit the floor, shattering and leaving a puddle of water, broken glass and flowers. "Patches!" the mother shouted from the kitchen. Patches could hear the mother stomping towards the living room. As she entered, he looked up at her with his tail between his legs and his eyes wide and apologetic. "Go to your doghouse," the mother said firmly. She pointed out through the kitchen towards the back garden, signalling for Patches to leave the house. Patches walked slowly through the house, keeping his tail between his legs. The mother opened the back door for him and pointed to his doghouse. He walked across the garden and into his doghouse, turned around a few times, and sat down resting his head on his front paws. Patches didn't like being told off. He knew he had broken something, and so there would be consequences. But that didn't make it feel any better. While he sat silently in his doghouse, he listened to the sounds in the garden. Sounds of birds singing, squirrels scampering, and trees rustling. As he listened to all the different sounds, his mind started to wander. He started to think about how he could play his game without getting told off. He enjoyed running around and having fun. He thought to himself whether he could set up the game in the garden. Being in his doghouse gave Patches a chance to think about his behaviour and what he could do differently next time. When the mother returned and told him he could now leave the doghouse, he decided to set up a course around the garden like the one in the living room, but hopefully without getting into trouble. Patches looked at the mother with a big grin, sticking his bottom in the air and waggling his tail. "Would you like me to help you make a course outside?" the mother asked. Patches barked and turned around. The mother and Patches created a course outside using the same cushions to jump onto like islands and broomsticks to make narrow paths to carefully follow. Patches enjoyed his new course, and he knew he wouldn't get told off or break anything as he ran around it. He played in his new course all afternoon until he was tired out. Once he was tired and he felt he had enough, he went back inside and settled down in his comfy dog basket and had a nap. and when you're ready, you can slowly fall deeper to sleep. Saving Prince Charming. As you close your eyes, I'm going to tell you the story about Cindy and her unicorn oracle, and with your eyes closed, you can listen to me reading this story. While I read this story, you can begin to feel relaxed, and as I read, you can imagine this story in your mind. One day, when Cindy was out riding on her unicorn oracle in a meadow far from the palace she lived in, she heard a noise coming from the woodland running along the edge of the meadow. "Come on, Oracle, let's see what's happening," Cindy said. Cindy nudged Oracle gently in the sides with her feet, caused Oracle to neigh and start cantering through the meadows towards the woodland. As they reached the woodland, Oracle slowed down to a trot before stopping a short distance from the edge of the trees. "Help, help!" a distressed young male called out. Between the trees, Cindy could see a boy being taken deep into the woods by a dragon. He looked like the prince who lived in a castle in a short ride from the meadow. His name was Joe, although Cindy liked to call him Prince Charming, because she liked his floppy blonde hair. Cindy didn't know what to do. She was just a small girl. She couldn't rescue the prince. Luckily for Cindy, Oracle had the ability to see both the future and the past. Cindy had an idea. She turned Oracle around and cantered off to the other side of the meadow where she knew they wouldn't be seen. From there, she told Oracle that she wanted to see into the future. She wanted to see what's going to happen to the prince and where he was being taken. Cindy placed her hand firmly on Oracle's neck, touching his hair, closed her eyes and focused. She could feel warmth as a bright white light formed around Oracle herself. She focused on the warm light passing down through her body, entering her head, down into her shoulders and arms, then into her body, and finally down into her legs and feet. As the white light passed down through her body, Cindy felt more comfortable and relaxed, and she started to count backwards in her mind, from 10 to 9, 8, 7, 6. With each number, she said, she felt even more relaxed. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Once she had counted to 1, she began to see things in her imagination. She began to see the prince being taken by the dragon deep into the woods to a hidden cave. There was a waterfall in the cave with a secret opening behind the waterfall. The dragon took the prince into that secret cave and placed him high on a ledge from where he was unable to climb down. Cindy looked further into the future to find out how she could save the prince. She saw a few opportunities where she might be able to sneak in and get into the secret cave. She could see that the dragon would leave the cave for a while and fly away. This was her chance to help. It isn't every day you get to rescue a prince, she thought to herself. After Cindy saw what she needed to see, she opened her eyes. She nudged Oracle gently in the sides, and he cantered up into the air on a cloud of light. They rode over the woodland until they were above the cave Cindy had seen in her imagination. She steered Oracle down towards the ground, a short distance from the cave, so that she could sneak quietly in and rescue the prince. Once on the ground, Cindy crept along, keeping low, behind the trees. She knew the dragon wasn't in the cave at the moment, but she was still worried that he may return sooner than expected. Once in the cave, Cindy lit a torch and ran over to the waterfall. To get into the secret cave behind the waterfall, Cindy had to climb up to the wet and slippery rocks. She clung on as tight as she could and scratched her legs on the rocks as she climbed. It was very hard work, but she managed it. Once she entered the secret cave, she lit another torch. The cave all sparkled in its dim light. Cindy could see the prince up on the ledge. The prince noticed Cindy and went to call down to her. "Shh," Cindy said. "I'm here to rescue you." But how? What if the dragon comes back? The prince replied. I know what I'm doing. We need to be quick. Cindy found a tree trunk. She knew it would reach the prince, but she wasn't strong enough to move it over and up to the ledge. There were some long vines in the cave. Suddenly Cindy had a plan. She grabbed the vines and threw them up to the prince. He then lowered them down to her, keeping tight hold of one end. When she grabbed the other end, Cindy tied it to the tree trunk. With all of his strength, the prince pulled the tree trunk across the ground and up to the ledge. Cindy helped too, by pushing as the prince pulled the trunk up. She also helped to keep the tree trunk steady. Eventually, the two of them got the tree trunk in place. The prince climbed down and thanked Cindy. He asked how they were going to escape. Cindy and the prince could hear the dragon returning to the cave. Its wings were noisy as they flapped, and it landed with an earth-rumbling thud. Cindy and the prince made it out of the secret cave and hid behind a rock in the main cave. It was pitch black. Cindy and the prince couldn't see anything, but they could hear the dragon's breathing. The dragon was walking towards the back of the cave to the waterfall. Cindy worried how the dragon was going to react when it realised the prince was gone. The bees effortlessly jumped up into the secret cave and let out a deafening roar. Fire erupted from inside the secret cave, bursting through the waterfall. Cindy and the prince held their breath. Her heart was beating so hard that she worried the dragon would be able to hear it and discover where they were hidden. She closed her eyes, held onto the prince, and focused on breathing slowly and deeply for a minute or two to help her relax and focus. Breathe in and breathe out. That's it. Breathe in and breathe out, Cindy told herself. After a few minutes, they could hear the dragon walk past them and leave the cave. It seemed to think that Cindy and the prince had already escaped, and it was looking for them. After the dragon left the cave, Cindy and the prince very quietly and carefully followed. It felt good to see sunlight and breathe in fresh air. Outside the cave, Cindy called to Oracle, who appeared out of the trees. She told the prince to get onto Oracle. They had to get the prince back to his castle and let the king and the queen know their son was safe. Cindy thought to herself that they would be surprised to see him saved by a small girl. Cindy gently squeezed Oracle with her feet, causing him to leap up into the sky on a rainbow and gallop off towards the castle. At the castle, the king and queen were so happy to see their son. As they entered, the queen wrapped him up in her arms so tight that the prince thought his eyes might pop out of his head. The king was also pleased to see his son. He wanted to send his finest knights out to fight the dragon. Cindy explained that the dragon was just doing what dragons do, but the important thing was that the prince was safe. They had their son back. Cindy didn't believe animals or people should be harmed, even the dragon. She told the king that there was only one dragon in the land, so it should be looked after. The king agreed. He put in place a plan to look after the dragon that would stop it from harming anyone again. The prince thanked Cindy for saving him. He hoped he would see her again in the future. Cindy was sure that they would see each other. She called Oracle over, climbed onto his back, gave him a nudge in his sides, and they rode off into the sky on a bright and colourful sparkling rainbow, looking forward to their next adventure. And when you're ready, you can slowly drift deeper asleep. The Butterfly and the Bee. As you close your eyes, I'm going to tell you the story about Robin the Butterfly and his friend Henry the Bee. And with your eyes closed, you can listen to me reading this story. While I read this story, you can begin to feel relaxed. And as I read, you can imagine this story in your mind. Robin hadn't been a butterfly long when he was drinking some nectar from a plant one day, and the bee came buzzing along to the same flower. While Robin drank, he looked over at the bee. The bee looked very busy. It was flying in and out of all the flowers. Robin noticed that the bee was getting all dirty. Every time he flew into a flower, he would come out with more sticky yellow bits all over his legs and back. "Excuse me," Robin began. "Excuse me." The bee was so busy it didn't seem to notice Robin calling. "Hello, Mr. Bee," Robin shouted. The bee landed next to Robin. "Can I help you?" the bee asked. "What are you doing? It looks like very dirty work. You're getting all yellow dirt all over you." "I'm gathering pollen and nectar." "What is all the yellow dirt you're getting all over your legs and back?" Robin asked curiously. "That is pollen. It helps the plants survive and helps feed my family." Robin didn't understand. He wanted to know how it helped the plants survive. The bee explained that the pollen rubbed off on him as he entered the plants. He carried it to the next plant, where he would crawl in and the pollen would rub off. He said it helped the plants have children. The bee saw this as something he did as payment for being allowed the nectar. The plants also allowed him to take away some of the pollen as well. "I'm Robin, by the way." "I'm Henry," replied the bee. "I used to be a caterpillar. Now I'm a butterfly. I've not been a butterfly for long, so I'm learning lots of new things." "What do you do with all the pollen and nectar?" Robin asked. "Come back to my home with me, and I will show you." Robin went with Henry back to Henry's home. As they approached, Robin could see how busy and chaotic it looked, hundreds of bees buzzing around, flying in and out of a hole in a tree. The closer they got, the noisier it got. "Here we are," Henry said. "This is home." Robin was curious. He landed as close as he could to the entrance and tried to peer in. It was very dark inside the hole. Henry went over to one of the bees and passed it some nectar. The bee ate some of it before passing it on to another bee, and that bee passed it on to another, and so on. Robin was curious about this. He could see that each bee was eating some of the pollen and nectar before sharing it with others. Robin noticed that the nectar food started out watery, but became less watery as each bee had some to eat. After the last bee had eaten some, the food was getting dry. The bee placed it in a hole and sealed the hole with some wax. "What was that the last bee placed in the hole?" "That was honey," Henry replied. "Once the liquid starts to get thick, we store it as a sweet, healthy food for the future." Robin had never seen where bees lived before, and he had never heard of honey. He wanted to know what the honey tasted like. It was dark in the bee's home. Henry told Robin that there was a place where he would be able to see into a bee's home. He told Robin that the home was called a hive. Henry and Robin flew to a nearby field where a man in a funny white suit covering his whole body and face was spraying smoke into his white boxes. Henry and Robin flew close to one of the boxes, keeping just out of the smoke. "Look, Robin," Henry said, as the man in the white suit lifted the lid for one of the boxes and raised something covered in bees up out of the box. Robin looked as the man sprayed smoke on the bees. This made some fly away, and others seemed to become very relaxed. He saw golden-coloured hexagons, all with wax lids. The man in the funny white suit had a device which pushed the honey out of the hexagons. As honey poured out of the machine, it glistened and sparkled in the sunlight. Henry suggested that Robin went and had a taste of the honey. So he did. He flew over to the large pot of gloopy honey and had a drink. He thought to himself how tasty the honey was. He didn't have any way of making this. He thought to himself how magical bees were, being able to work together to make something so tasty. Henry flew over the container of honey. "Here, I've got you some honey to take home with you." Robin felt so lucky. He had only just met Henry, and is already being so kind. As the sun set over the meadow, Henry and Robin said goodbye to each other. Henry went back to his hive, and Robin went home with his pot of honey and the feeling that this had been a good day. And in time, he could slowly drift deeper asleep. The Secret Garden. As you close your eyes, I'm going to tell you the story about Polly the princess and the secret garden. And with your eyes closed, you can listen to me reading this story. While I read this story, you can begin to feel relaxed. And as I read, you can imagine this story in your mind. One crisp autumn morning, Polly was playing in the garden with her kitten. Suddenly the kitten ran over to a nearby flower bed and started digging. Polly wondered what her kitten was doing, so she went over to see. She didn't want the kitten digging up the flower bed. She knew that would make her mum, the queen, angry. When Polly got over to her kitten, she saw that it was digging up a small metal box. Polly thought this was exciting, so she too started to help dig up the box to see what it was. Polly's hands and the kitten's paws got very dirty as they dug in the ground, but Polly didn't care. She wanted to know what was inside the metal container, so she kept on digging. Once she got the box free from the ground, she had to find a way to open it. She always had hair grips in her hair, so she decided to use one of the hair grips to try to pick the lock. Polly carefully slid it into the lock and started to turn it slowly. She held her head close to the lock to try to hear the sound of the lock moving. She also closed her eyes and stuck out her tongue. Somehow this seemed to help her concentrate and focus. The kitten also seemed to become very still and focus on Polly's small fingers carefully holding and jiggling the hair grip in the lock. After a few minutes there was a pop and the lid sprung open. Inside the metal container was a single rolled up old sheet of paper. Polly gently removed the paper from the tin, put the tin to one side and started to unroll the paper. As she unrolled it, she realised it was a map of the palace that she lived in. She recognised a line showing where the palace was, and circles marking out the big trees in the garden, and lines marking out the paths across the garden. But there was one path on the map she didn't recognise. She had never seen this path in the garden before, and it didn't seem to go anywhere. Polly tried to work out where the path was. She looked for things she recognised, like trees and paths. She went to the path nearest to the one she couldn't see in the garden. She looked on the map to see what other landmarks there were that she could use to find the old path. She saw 2 trees that the path passed between, and another further along that the path used to go alongside. From this information, she was able to work out where the path was. She started to follow where she thought the path was, not knowing what she would find. To her, it looked like a normal garden grass, nothing special. When she reached where she thought the path ended on the map, she stopped to look around. It looked like the path didn't lead anywhere. She wondered whether that was why someone got rid of the path and planted grass over it. But then she thought, why was the map hidden in the metal box and buried in the garden? There has to be something here, Polly thought to herself. She looked closely at the ground, trying to find any clue about what was on this spot. Polly couldn't find anything, so she sat down on the grass and called over her kitten to play. As she sat down with a thud, she heard a hollow echo beneath her. She pulled up some of the grass to reveal a silver metal lid. As she pulled up more and more, she was able to read the writing on the lid. Secret Garden. Polly smiled. She always wanted a secret garden. But then she thought to herself, underground is a strange place for a secret garden. She had to lift the lid and find out. The lid was surprisingly light. She was expecting it to be heavy or stuck down so that it wouldn't move. Polly lifted the lid and peered inside the tunnel. As soon as it was open, the tunnel lit up. The walls were made of light. Then a small white platform rose up to the top of the tunnel. Polly picked up a kitten and stepped onto the platform. The platform was like a lift. Once she stood on it, it started to go down, slow and smooth, back into the tunnel. Polly thought that she had been in the lift for ages. She felt like it was still moving, but everything around her was so white she wasn't quite sure. Suddenly a lift appeared above ground again. This confused Polly. She thought she was heading down. How did she end up going up and coming out the top again? This wasn't the only thing that confused Polly. The garden she'd come out of the lift in wasn't her garden. This must be the secret garden. It was definitely a garden she had never seen before. This garden was strange. It was like night time in this garden. Polly could see stars and colours in the sky. The plants were unusual. They were glowing with different coloured lights. There were purple flowers, pink flowers, red flowers, and blue flowers. Polly could see hummingbirds with shining wings buzzing in and out of the plants, and many glowing insects flying around. Polly thought about how much colour there was, and how beautiful this garden was. It appeared so magical. As Polly walked around the garden, she noticed that each step she took left a faint pink glowing footprint on the ground. This is such a magical place, Polly thought to herself. She knew she'd have to leave the garden soon. She didn't want her mum to worry about where she was. Polly and her kitten played in the secret garden for a while before heading back to the lift. Polly and the kitten stood on the lift, and with a gentle movement, it began to lower down into the bright tunnel. And after what seemed like ages, the lift raised her back out onto her garden. She looked around. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the garden definitely looked like her normal garden. Polly loved how she had a secret garden she could visit any time she wanted. She picked up her kitten, went back into the palace, and after her little adventure, she settled down on the sofa in the main living room, in front of the crackling log fire, and drifted off into a daydream, looking forward to visiting the secret garden again in the future. And when you're ready, you can slowly drift deeper asleep.